The air in the land agent's office was thick with the dust of unread ledgers and the faint, sour smell of ink. Elspeth Monroe kept her hands folded in her lap, her knuckles white against the dark wool of her skirt. Across the small pine desk, Silas Blackwood sat just as still, his gaze fixed on the document between them. He was a man made of straight lines and quiet angles, from his square jaw to the set of his shoulders. "So we are agreed," Mr. Abernathy, the agent, said, his spectacles slipping down his nose. He pushed the paper forward with a pudgy finger. 160 acres, filed under the Homestead Act in the name of Silas Blackwood. Capital for initial supplies, lumber, seed, a new plow, to be provided by Mrs. Elspeth Monroe from her late husband's estate. In exchange for which, and for her labor in proving up the claim, Mr. Blackwood will, upon the satisfactory construction of a permanent dwelling, take Mrs. Monroe as his legal wife, thereby granting her dower rights to the property. Abernathy cleared his throat, a sound like gravel shifting. "It is a practical arrangement, quite common." Elspeth met Silas's eyes. His were the color of a winter sky just before snow, a deep and serious gray. There was no warmth in them, but there was no deceit either. She knew what people in Laramie said about him, that he was quiet to the point of strangeness, that he'd come back from the war with more silence than he'd left with. She also knew he was the only man who hadn't looked at her with pity or proposition since she'd buried Robert. He looked at her like she was a person with a problem to be solved. Right now, that was all she wanted. "The arrangement is satisfactory," she said, her voice even. She had practiced this tone, stripping it of any waver or weakness. "The dwelling must have a plank floor, a stone hearth, and 2 glass windows. The well must be dug before the first frost. These are my terms." Silas gave a single, deliberate nod. His focus was entirely on her, ignoring the agent. "The terms are fair." He did not smile. Neither did she. This was not an occasion for happiness. It was an act of mutual survival. She had a little money and a powerful fear of another Wyoming winter without a roof she could trust. He had a claim, strong hands, and a need for the stability a wife and capital would bring. Love was a language her first husband had spoken fluently, a torrent of beautiful, useless words that had left her with nothing but debts and a grave to tend. Silas Blackwood, she suspected, barely knew the alphabet of it. Good. Poetry couldn't stop a blizzard. A well-built wall could. "Then sign," she said. He took the pen, dipped it, and scratched his name onto the paper. The sound was stark in the quiet room. He pushed the document and the pen to her. Her signature was a mirror of her state of mind, clear, firm, and without flourish. They stood. Instead of a handshake, Silas simply met her gaze again. "We'll start tomorrow at sunup," he said. It was not a question. "I'll be ready," she replied. And that was how it began. Not with a promise, but with a contract. The work was a brutal teacher. The sun beat down, the wind never ceased, and the earth of the Laramie Plains was stubborn, a mix of tough grass and stone. They worked from the first hint of light until the last, speaking only when necessary. "Hand me the adze. The water's low. More sod." Their conversations were a litany of labor. Elspeth watched him. It became a habit, a study in quiet competence. He moved with an economy of motion she'd never seen. When he swung an axe, it landed true every time. When he measured a beam, he did it once. He never wasted a step, a word, or a nail. Her first husband, Robert, had been a man of grand, sweeping gestures that usually ended in something being knocked over. Silas built things. He built a foundation that was level, walls that were square, and a routine that was as solid and predictable as the sunrise. Every morning, he would rise before her, stoke the fire he'd banked the night before, and have coffee boiling by the time she emerged from her small tent. He never mentioned it. He simply did it. One evening, she saw him sitting by the firelight working on one of her leather work gloves where the seam at the thumb had split. He used a small awl and waxed thread, his large hands surprisingly deft. The next morning, the glove was sitting on the crate by her tent, mended and stronger than before. He was asleep when she found it. She put it on, and the warmth of his recent touch seemed to linger in the leather. The feeling was unsettling, an unexpected crack in the practical armor she had so carefully constructed. Days bled into weeks. The sod house, their soddy, rose from the plains, a sturdy, earthbound thing. She worked beside him, her muscles aching and her hands raw, but a strange sense of satisfaction grew in her. She wasn't being cared for. She was a creator in her own right. She laid the sod bricks with him, her smaller hands fitting them into place while his strength provided the lift. They were a machine of 2 parts, each essential, each understanding its role without discussion. One afternoon, a neighbor from a claim 2 miles east, a chatty man named Henderson, rode by. He reined in his horse, eyeing their progress. "Well now, Blackwood, you two look right settled in," he said, a grin splitting his weathered face. "Like 2 peas in a pod." Elspeth, who was on the crude ladder helping Silas position a ridgepole, felt a hot flush of embarrassment. She stiffened. All business. "The pitch is wrong on this side, Silas. We'll lose heat. It needs another inch of lift." Silas didn't so much as glance at Henderson. He squinted at the pole, then back at her. "You're right," he said, his voice its usual low baritone. He shifted his weight, his shoulder muscles bunching under his shirt. "Hold your end steady." Henderson's grin faltered, his attempt at neighborly teasing falling flat against their wall of sheer industry. He mumbled something about the weather and rode off. As the sound of his horse's hooves faded, Elspeth chanced to look at Silas. He was concentrating on the beam, but the corner of his mouth was turned up in the barest hint of a smile. It was such a small, fleeting thing, but it struck her with the force of a shout. He had understood her discomfort and deflected the intrusion without making a show of it. He had protected their private world of work. The setback came in late August. The sky turned a bruised greenish-black in the space of an hour. The hail came without warning, not small pellets, but chunks of ice, the size of hens' eggs. They scrambled for the shelter of the half-roofed soddy, but there was little protection to be had. The storm raged, a deafening roar that vibrated through the very ground. When it finally passed, leaving a world scoured and unnaturally silent, they emerged to survey the damage. The western section of the new sod roof, the product of a solid week of back-breaking labor, had been shredded. Mud and ruined turf slumped down the wall. Their small vegetable garden was pounded into green pulp. It was a catastrophe. Elspeth stared at it, and for the first time since the day Robert's heart had given out, she felt the cold tendrils of true despair. All that work, all that sweat, wiped out in minutes. It was the universe reminding her that a woman alone, a person alone, was always in storm away from ruin. She sank onto a wet log, the fight draining out of her. Silas didn't speak. He didn't offer empty comforts or optimistic promises. He walked the perimeter of the house, his boots sinking into the mud. He prodded the damaged wall with his hand, looked up at the sky, and then came and sat on the log beside her. Not too close, but near enough that she could feel the solid presence of him. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the water drip from the ruined eaves. Finally he spoke, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. "We'll fix it tomorrow." She let out a shaky breath, a sound that was half sob, half laugh. "Just like that?" "It's just sod and sweat," he said, looking at the mess. "We have more of both." His words landed in her exhausted mind and took root. Robert would have raged at the heavens. He would have spun a tale of defiance or sunk into a poetic melancholy. He would have made the storm about himself. Silas made it about the work. It was a problem to be solved, not a tragedy to be endured. He saw the path forward, a straight, unadorned line of labor. In that moment, watching his profile against the bruised twilight, she understood. The safety she was building wasn't just in the walls of the house, it was in the man sitting next to her. The realization was terrifying. The contract was about land and law, but the foundation they had laid between them was made of something else entirely: shared silence, quiet respect, and the steady, unspoken promise that he would not break. 2 months later, the house was finished. It was small and smelled of fresh-cut pine, damp earth, and stone. But it was sturdy. The floor was planked, the hearth was stone, and 2 glass windows, a luxury she had insisted on, let in the pale autumn light. The well was deep, and the water was sweet. The terms of the contract had been met. They stood inside as dusk settled, the single room filled with long shadows. Tomorrow, they would ride to Laramie and see the justice of the peace. The thought of it made her stomach clench. Silas turned from where he'd been testing the fit of the door he'd just hung. His face was unreadable in the dim light. "Elspeth," he said, his voice quiet, yet it filled the small space. "The house is built. The terms are met." He paused, and she could feel the weight of his next word.